Warning: World Weary Podcasts occasionally discusses mature themes and uses colorful language.
Welcome to World Weary. I'm the British one, Violet Starr.
I'm the American one, Cassiopeia Walker.
Have you ever brought something into your home that you regret? Maybe you inherited something with bad vibes. Perhaps you've got a weird Victorian painting of a child where the eyes follow you across the room. How about that spooky clown statue that you bought at a creepy antique shop from that weird old antique dealer who keeps winking at you in a creepy way and is secretly the devil? Today's episode is loosely about haunted objects.
Ooh.
Insert echoey ghost noise.
Yes.
Everyday items, furniture, things. I guess to start off, if anyone should have ever had a haunted item in their house, it should have been me, because when I was like 9 or 10, or maybe younger than that, 9 or 10ish, I think, and I lived in the isolated bungalow in the woods, which I've mentioned before in another recording. We actually had a real human skull in the house.
No, you didn't tell me this ever. What's wrong with you?
A real human skull. And not only was it a human skull, but it had been painted black in black gloss paint or something, or dyed black at some point.
Was it Jeffrey Dahmer's?
And so basically my mum got given this skull by her boyfriend at the time, who's like kind of eccentric, like artist, antique dealer kind of guy, or he just had a lot of antique stuff. So when he met my mum, he gave her loads of weird antiques from his house, like, so she got all this insect taxidermy collection.
Oh, okay.
And
is that where that came from?
Yeah, all those like butterflies and preserved bugs and things.
I've seen it. It is, you walk into her mom's house and the decor is straight out of Silence of the Lambs. I shit you not. Every time I walk in, I feel like I'm, all of a sudden, like, I need to use the phone. That's my best.
Yeah. I
Can
always
use your phone?
I always wonder what people think when they come around to my mum's house. Like,
she's got paintings. I can't begin to describe to the
because I'm used to it. This has been my existence. That's normal for me. So so back around before Christmas, we had that little like festive gathering that I hosted at my mum's place, and there was a few people who hadn't ever been to the house before that came. So there was like, after everyone left, I kind of thought, I wonder what people actually thought.
So,
I bet people are always surprised that my house is like that. They're not expecting it.
You walk into a very old sort of terraced cottage kind of house.
Yeah.
At the end terrace. It's very old. You go through a curtain or two. You have to go through
we're talking like 17th century.
Yes.
No, not 17th century. It's 18th or 19th century.
So it's basically, you walk in and everything is scary. There's paintings that are collages of creepy circus things and people with eyes cut out or like it dressed in tutus. There's stuffed birds and animals everywhere. There's creepy butterfly collection. Don't open those drawers. You don't want to see what's in there. You are about to be asked to put some lotion on. There's like, it's just, it is an art piece, your house, actually. I would say it is beautiful. Like, it isn't actually, but it is very spooky. There's a lot of scary stuff.
I mean, it just,
but bright and orange and
it explains my mum a lot.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because she's made most of that stuff, or like selected lots of that stuff. But the thing that people are always impressed by is the big, the stuffed deer head.
Oh, yeah.
With the massive horns.
Oh my gosh, and it's striped.
So people are always confused because they're like, is that a real proper piece of taxidermy, or is it like an art piece that my mum's made? Because
I think it's both, isn't it?
yeah, it's a little bit of both. So the only real animal taxidermy on that are the horns, and they're actually backwards. So like on the original deer, they're like facing the other way, but mum's put them so they're sort of swooping back,
the look of
like a windswept kind of horn.
For the listener, she's motioning, but it looks like she's actually doing a ritual to a goddess. She's showing you how antlers work, but Google it.
Yeah, and it's covered in like a tiger.
Yes,
fur, but it's fake tiger.
Yeah, it's like a fake
fabric. And then the art mum got, so the inside of the deer's face isn't taxidermy either. It's just a foam. It's from like a taxidermy shop, basically. Like you can buy like a foam like body that you use underneath, and then you put the skin over that, because obviously
I've wondered this for years, but I've never found a polite way to ask.
Yeah, it's all foam.
I just assumed it was all real, but it's very well done.
Yeah.
It is. She's just got. I can't. The fact that shows how much I've managed to desensitize to the craziness of that place, because I forgot about that main feature of the room. Stuffed parrots. It's crazy. And then they're all wearing jewelry and like they're really fabulous. Oh yeah, everything's fabulous.
The taxidermy has got jewels and
everything is spooky, circusy, but fabulous, and all the color schemes work well in your house. It's just really interesting. Yeah. Insert Instagram World Weary podcast. We'll take a sneaky photo of one of the paintings.
Yeah. Whew. Okay, so in the house when I was like 9 or 10, we have the skull. And my mum's boyfriend, who'd given us the skull, so he'd given us the taxidermy stuff.
Oh God, I forgot you have a human skull!
And he also gave us the skull and a vintage electric organ, which was like the most exciting thing ever. Bet. I think we also got a piano off him. I can't remember. But in our kitchen, we had this freaking weird, like, retro electric organ that made really creepy noises. It was a really scary thing to play. And had all, like, old electronics and stuff, like weird little old LEDs and stuff like that. And so me and my sister would be, like, we used to sit there, like, playing chopsticks on the vintage electric organ. No. And on the shelf above us was this black skull.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I wonder how many unwitting rituals you did in front.
Yeah. And that skull, when we moved out of that bungalow in the woods, my mum discreetly decided to bury it in the woods near our house. So
your mom's a murderer. Why would she bury it, Violet?
Well, I think she felt kind of there was something a bit. She felt bad about having the skull, and basically we sort of found out that when we researched it a bit, that lots of that skull, because it had it'd been like scalped, so you could see like some of the sort of brain bit inside that holds the brain in your skull.
Okay.
And so what that skull had been was like a thing for like training doctors and stuff in the past. It was like I forgot the word, but like a training thing basically. And loads of them had come from India, of these skulls. So they're like poor Indian people would like sell their like the bodies of their dead relatives or like bits of their bodies or whatever. And then they would be used for medical training in the West. So we felt a bit kind of sad about it. That was the thing, it never felt spooky to us, you know. It wasn't haunted in any way.
Yeah,
it just,
but you should have been
but
haunted.
it should have been. But we kind of had more of a, just like quite a healthy respect for the fact that it was quite sad, and it was sort of like when we touched the skull or looked at it, it was just like, oh, like a reminder of our own mortality at like 9 years old while we're playing on the piano. But Mum buried it, and she like I asked her about it recently because it was sort of a foggy memory, but I knew I remember the skull, and I remember Mum had buried it in the woods when we moved on the day we moved out. So it was like a beautiful autumn day with like orange trees. We lived in orange leaves and stuff blowing down. We lived like right in the middle of this wood, like hardly any neighbors, super isolated, super bleak and magical. And there was all these orange leaves falling down, and mum is like a single mum doing it on her own, packing up this bungalow on her own with 2 little kids.
Oh god.
Being like, girls, like get in the car then, and like wait, and then like discreetly going off and burying a black fucking skull in the woods.
Oh my gosh, what are people gonna say?
The thing that freaks me out is the day that someone finds that skull and is like, what the,
No, that's the thing. Someone's gonna find it. It's painted black, and they're gonna immediately be like, "Oh my god!"
Yeah.
And then they're gonna know it's near this bungalow, and they're gonna go through. They're gonna go through the list of owners, and your mom's gonna eventually.
Well, the good thing is, I think it's pretty obvious to like any kind of specialist that once they look into it, it's clearly one of these training pieces.
So,
They could tell it's an antique kind of skull. And like the way that it's been cut and stuff makes it clear that it's it
just
was like for medical purposes.
That though, just a lone skull, no other body part, just like a skull. I don't know if the paint would survive by now.
You would definitely think someone had been doing something occult in those woods.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
I'm not entirely ruling out that she didn't. You had to sleep at some point as a kid. You don't know what your mom was up to in 3 hours.
I do, because I would wake up, she'd be playing Tomb Raider 3 in the living room. I watched through the door.
Oh no.
But no, it was like kind of cool, but it was like a good lesson for us kids to kind of hang out with a bit of somebody who used to be alive. So it was a good little life lesson, but looking back on it, like super weird. I mean,
no bones about it.
You could make a very aesthetic short film about our life at that time.
I really want to see that film one day. So I hope we get famous. Share our podcast, because Violet's film needs to be made. You guys don't understand. It is a rags to well, not riches, but maybe with your help, a rags to riches story. The little gypsy girl that we become. Oh my gosh.
You've got some creepy stuff in your new home when you just moved in here and opened up the attic.
Oh yeah, upstairs is a giant, up in the attic of this place, the loft. The loft. I can't do a British accent to save my life.
The attic.
The attic.
Yeah.
All right. There's a giant stuffed teddy bear. For no reason, there's a metal lantern next.
Because it's all very empty up there. So it was like
empty.
the moment you was like, okay, let's check out the attic, and you go up on that ladder and you turn the light on, and there's nothing. You scan around because there's sort of nothing on your left, and you turn, and then it's whoop. There's
a giant. I'm talking. It's almost the size of me. This teddy bear. It's a giant blue teddy bear with a bow next to like a big old lantern, I guess, that comes with the bear. I guess he needs a giant lantern. What the fuck does a bear need a lantern?
Keep him warm up there. He's been lost and alone in the attic for so long.
I don't think about it. I didn't think about it till now. I don't know if that bear is haunted.
The other thing is when you just moved in here, I remember coming round and there were those like...
I thought they were good vibes.
it was good vibes, but there was those gross, those trashy, like artificial white lilies in a vase, in like they're like dirty jelly stuff, and they'd pick up like all the old dust and germs of the former residents, and I was like, chuck that auspicious shit out, like
you know what's weird? Our neighbors over there to the left, across the way, and we live in a little area where there's houses facing each other at the front, but the neighbor to the right of us here has the same thing in their window. A gross lilies in jelly, which is the tackiest fucking form of fake plant.
That jelly stuff just...
No offense, if you've got one,
burn it. It picks up the dust. They're just become a dust ball after like a day of being in your house.
Morgan has a very eccentric, like his stepdad's mother is very eccentric. And she, for Christmas, when I first met her, got me one of those, a tiny jelly flower.
Oh, okay.
And I just
like a mini candle thing, or like ornament.
Right away. I love her, but like, I was like, I'm not keeping this.
I remember when I was a kid, we had like huge, at my dad's house, there were those huge like jelly candle things. Like it was like a massive one.
No.
But it just, no one ever burnt it, and it would just get dust on it. And kids, we would poke it and like mash up all the jelly.
Oh no.
And they would look so gross. No one ever chucked them out. Yeah.
That's haunted.
They're just a bit trashy.
People's houses, if you've got a jelly thingy, I mean, you do realize dust is like dead skin. Get it out. Get out. Sorry, anytime we can quote that movie.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of Busby's Stoop Chair.
Busby's Stoop Chair. I don't know this at all. I'm ready.
Okay. So I'm just gonna have to point out before I go into this that this happened like a few hundred years ago. There are loads of different variations of the story, because there's no doubt this story's been really embellished over time. So what I've done here is I've read through so many different tellings and variations. So I've kind of had to piece together the most likely facts and the most of the rumours, or the kind of heart of the rumours, to try and give you an all-encompassing version that hopefully gets the essence of what's going on here.
That's what we go for, is like we have healthy skepticism as well. Like we tend to go for, I'm not gonna be a crazy researcher, let me tell you.
Yeah, this ain't hard facts. I ain't got time for just some pure hard facts. This is a little bit of everything to weave together
a lovely tale,
a story that connects to every dimension of possibility.
From this horrible world, Violet.
Okay, I will. So let's go back in time. It's the late 17th century. We are in rural northern Yorkshire, which is where we were at last time in the episode. We were in Yorkshire and Lancashire a lot. So that's up north.
I feel like we live here now.
Yeah. Up north England. Middle of nowhere. A collation of little Yorkshire villages. And the landlord of an inn, which is basically a pub with rooms that you can stay in, near a village called Sandhutton, is a man called Thomas Busby. So Thomas is an all-round dodgy guy. He's known locally to be a ruffian and a rogue and a thief. He's got a drink problem, supposedly being the landlord of this pub. He's, a bit of a drinker. He gets very violent when he's drunk. He gets in fights a lot. And he's a bit of a crim. So in comes a man called Daniel Orty. And he originally hails from Leeds. And he purchases a secluded farm quite close to the village of Sandhutton and near another village called Kirby Wisk.
Kirby Wisk.
Don't you love English town names?
I actually do.
Orty is also a bit criminal. Doesn't take long for his family to become affiliated with the dodgy local landlord Thomas Busby.
Oh, lovely.
The local pub scoundrel.
Wee.
So the story goes that Thomas Busby, he actually marries Daniel's daughter Elizabeth. An alliance between the two criminal families.
Yes.
So her and Thomas live in the inn at Sandhutton, and Thomas actually goes into business with Daniel, who's now his father-in-law, and together they counterfeit coins and carry out all kinds of unlawful dealings from the farmhouse that Daniel owns. And Daniel even supposedly creates a hidden room underneath the farmhouse that you can only access through a tunnel in the cellar, so that they're clearly up to some very dodgy stuff at this farmhouse. Counterfeiting coins. It's a little criminal empire kind of bubbling up
Yorkshire
in the middle of nowhere. village criminal empire. So 1702 comes around. It's now technically the 18th century. And Thomas and Daniel fall out with each other over some aspect of their criminal enterprise. They're known not to have the best relationship even as business partners. Thomas Busby would often be pissed off with Daniel over something, and that Daniel wasn't entirely happy about Thomas's marriage with his daughter Elizabeth. So one of the versions of the story states that Thomas and Daniel have this massive bust up one day, and Thomas goes off and gets super drunk. And later on, he goes to the inn where he and Elizabeth live and finds his father-in-law business partner Daniel waiting for him there. So they have another argument, and supposedly Daniel threatens to take Elizabeth away. But according to the stories, what really rubs salt in the wound is that during this altercation between Thomas and Daniel, Daniel goes and sits down in a chair in the inn. But it's not just any chair. He sits in Thomas Busby's favourite chair.
Oh no.
So you know how, like, in...
Men in chairs.
In British pubs especially, there's, like, if you're the hardened, like, regular alky in the pub, or maybe you're, like, the landlord...
Open to close.
You know, you have a special chair, or like when you die, maybe they put a plaque like in the pub for you or something. So
it's true though, yeah. It's pub culture in England is amazing.
So supposedly Thomas Busby has his own special chair, even though he's the landlord, in his pub. And so this, by Daniel sitting in the chair, this tips the drunken, violent Thomas over the edge, and he forcibly removes Daniel from the chair and chucks him out of the pub. So the evening goes on, but Thomas doesn't cool down, and he continues to kind of rage over the altercation. He probably drinks like well into the night, and at some point in the night he decides to go to Daniel Orty's farmhouse. He finds Daniel and he bludgeons him to death with a hammer, and then he hides the body in the nearby woodland. Pretty quickly, someone raises the alarm. Someone's realised Daniel's missing, and probably suspecting foul play, they organise a search and they find his body in the woods. So considering that the two had this huge bust up the day before, you know, someone puts two and two together and they arrest Thomas Busby while he's in his inn, and, well, some say, sitting in his favourite chair.
Oh, shit, you don't sit on my chair.
So he's tried for murder at the York Assizes, and he's sentenced to death for the murder of Daniel. And he gets gibbeted. You know what gibbeting is?
I have no idea what that is. It doesn't sound good.
Let me
Trigger warning for listeners, because I didn't know there was... Well, I mean, it's a haunted objects episode. There's going to be murder.
Yeah, get used to it.
Or death.
So, gibbeting, basically, you get hung, and I think, like, there's a gallows type structure called a gibbet as well that they do the hanging on.
Such a cute name.
The gibbet.
The gibbet. Oh, should we do a bit of gibbeting?
Oh, jibbity jib. So then your body gets, after you get hung, your body gets covered in pitch, so you basically get tarred.
Oh no! People loved tarring back in the day.
It was they had a good reason, because that preserved your remains a bit longer.
Oh.
So then they display your tarred body remains to the public. In this case, Thomas Busby's suspended from chains from a post or stoop.
Oh,
so the post is called a stoop for everyone to see. So
I'm
think of
playing
those.
A game right now with the stoop, and I didn't know why it was called that.
There we go.
Gosh.
Think of like scenes in historical movies of like the skeleton hanging in a cage from like a post.
Oh my
Or like
God.
Robin Hood or something, where like the dad is like dead in a cage and stuff.
So that is real.
That's based off of gibbeting, which is like you display the remains afterwards to like make everyone
For me,
else
it
live in
reminds me
fear
Conan.
of doing something bad.
Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing, you know.
Oh, yeah. Or
Like,
is it Conan or... No, Willow. Willow.
oh, yeah, no, Willow, he gets put in the cage as well.
Willow.
Yeah.
Val Kilmer, is it?
Yes.
And he's in that... Yes.
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
But he didn't get gibbeted.
No, he just gets
just in a cage,
They just hang him in a
starving to
cage. They
death.
didn't go full gibbet
No, that's unfortunate.
with him.
I mean, it's Val Kilmer, so it's okay.
But so yeah, that was just to like put off other people from
Yeah.
murdering basically and doing bad stuff. So, but Thomas Busby's gibbeting is like extra dark
Oh.
because he gets gibbeted
Different tar recipe.
at Sandhutton off the old Great North Crossroads, apparently in full view of his inn.
Oh no!
Yeah, so he like dies like looking at.
Oh, I wonder who takes over the inn. I'm guessing his... Wait. Thomas is just like... Yeah, he owned the inn. It's his daughter, Elizabeth, right? Or it's Daniel's daughter.
Daniel's
Daniel
daughter.
Farming
So
daughter, but
Thomas has
is the inn
murdered his father-in-law.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So that's sort of the end of everything we know as to what happened with Thomas Busby in the inn. He gets executed in sort of view of the inn, and his remains are there near the inn for like any passers-by, any of his old crook friends to see.
That's really rough. That's really rough because that means your family, your friends, everybody has to basically shun the memory of you as well.
And some tellings of the story say that he was allowed a last drink in his inn.
I was just about to ask you.
Yes.
I was just about to make a joke, but I pulled myself back because I thought it'd be too morbid. I was going to be like, just one last drink before I go.
Yeah, literally.
Don't know why I'm doing it.
Doesn't get more British than that, I suppose. And a sit down in his favourite chair.
Oh my gosh.
Before he's executed. And they say that he cursed his favourite chair as he left for the gibbet. Another telling of the story says that he actually cursed the chair when he got arrested because they supposedly caught him at his inn, or arrested him at his inn while he was like lounging out post-murder in his special chair. So he supposedly cursed anyone who sat in his special chair.
We're about to get a death list. Yeah, death list.
So time passes, the murder, the execution of Busby, and the sort of criminal legacy, the story of it all leaves a bit of a bad vibe in that area, in those villages. And well over 100 years later, this historian called William Grange, he sort of researched Busby's execution and wrote the sort of story of it. And he wrote that the bones of the poor wretch who had committed murder were hung to fester in the sunshine and blow in the tempest until they fell piecemeal to earth, and tradition yet tells tales of night wanderers being terrified when passing this dreaded spot. So it already, in that 100 years, become a haunted place to the locals. You know, people still remembered the story. Everyone still passed on the tale of what had happened there.
And I wonder how much of it is due to trauma of seeing something like that, and you have to talk about it and ascribe.
Was that, you know, it had only been maybe like 50 years before that people's grandparents remembered seeing the remains, and that's passed down, and, you know, 4 or 5 generations later, 6 generations, people are still remembering what happened in that place. Anyway, so it's bad vibes, left a bad taste in that area. So in classic British style, the inn gets renamed the Busby Stoop Inn. After the stoop that his remains were displayed from in front of his pub.
At this point, 100 years later. Oh my gosh.
Because we like to be reminded of bad shit, such as murder and execution.
You guys love it. Every pub is so fucked up.
And the locals report that the inn is haunted by Busby's ghost, as well as the spot where he was hung and gibbeted nearby. And it's at this time that the legend that Thomas cursed his favourite chair in the pub kind of takes off. So it's claimed that death will come to anyone that sits in his chair. So even from beyond the grave, he did not want anybody else enjoying his special, comfy, fancy chair. So what does the innkeeper, at some point, an anonymous innkeeper, decide to do? They decide to keep this particular chair out on display in the pub. And apparently
They
still
have the chair.
Well, we've got a lot of history to get through.
God. At this point, 100 years later.
So, at some point between the time that Busby was executed and, like, the 50s or the war, someone gets this chair out and puts it in the spot and says, this is, you know, the cursed, haunted chair. You know, why would the owner of an inn, a very well-respected class of people, are landlords and publicans, why would they knowingly keep a haunted, cursed chair that brings death to anyone that sits on it in the middle of a pub? A place where people are inebriated, aren't able to make sound decisions, and are probably going to want to sit down. Surely they're not money spinners. You know, it's not like you need attention and a bit of drama to attract tourists to your isolated pub in the middle of nowhere in rural northern Yorkshire. I don't know. It's just like, imagine being like a travelling salesman or something.
I want to see the receipts for the chair. That's the thing. But we'll suspend disbelief.
Oh yeah, we will. This is his chair. I mean, imagine you are a travelling salesman. You arrive at the Busby Stoop Inn one evening.
That's an interesting name.
Yeah,
Busby Stoop.
You get a pint from the landlord, and you're really cold and wet, but you see this attractive oak chair set up in an inviting corner of the pub by a crackling fire, and you're about to sit down in it, and the landlord's like, "You don't want to sit in that chair, mate. That's Busby's Stoop chair."
But what?
The Brits. Okay, so what happens to those whose bottoms make contact with the chair?
Oh no, that's not sitting Busby.
Okay. In 1894, the haunted chair supposedly takes its first victim.
Ooh, height of spiritualism. I can feel the energy. The 1890s.
A chimney sweep comes in for a drink, and he sits in the chair. He gets real drunk. He leaves the inn, and the next morning, he's found hanging from a gatepost close to the site of Busby's execution.
No way. Are these documented cases as
1894.
Well? Oh my god.
At first, it appeared to be an act of suicide, but then 20 years later, on his deathbed, a friend of the chimney sweep confessed to having murdered him and made it look like a suicide.
Oh my god!
The night after he sat in the chair.
Oh.
Then we jump to the Second World War. There's a huge Royal Air Force base at a village called Skipton-on-Swale. Not too far a journey to the Busby Stoop Inn. It was probably one of the closest pubs to the air base. And Canadian airmen from the base would come in for a drink at the pub.
Oh, look at this place. It's quite quaint.
And they would, of course, joke around about sitting in a chair. Because, you know,
Canadians
supposedly Brits too superstitious to mess with that stuff.
I thought you were polite, Canada.
Only the Canadian airmen were messing with it at this time. And all the locals claimed that those airmen that did actually sit in the chair, they didn't return from their bombing missions.
No.
Then we skip to 1968. 2 airmen from the base were overheard daring each other to sit in the chair.
So in between, there are no reports of people actually sitting in the chair. Most of the time, it's a novelty thing. People don't.
Yeah, most people heed the warning of the landlord.
I would never sit in the chair, Violet. I am a rational person most of the time. I'm never fucking sitting in that chair. I'll go to the pub. I am not sitting anywhere in that pub. I'm standing the entire time just in case I sit in the chair. Sorry, go ahead.
So in 1968, 2 airmen from the base are overheard daring each other to sit in the chair.
Oh, these airmen.
And apparently they both sat in the chair. And then, on their journey back home to the base, their car crashed into a tree and they both died as a result. Then, in the early 70s, a man called Tony Earnshaw, he takes over running the inn as the landlord.
Oh shit! This is when shit's going down because he would have been like, "Fuck this PR shit. It's my pub now."
Wow.
What's he gonna do?
Let's see.
Oh god.
And the ghost of Thomas Busby clearly did not want Tony to succeed in the pub business. Because the haunted chair goes on a killing spree.
What the fuck?
Yeah. It goes on a freaking killing spree.
Yes, chair. Sorry, no, that's bad. That is bad, but I just, like, I don't know why I'm rooting for the chair. I just got excited.
It's there to kill off all of Tony's custom.
It's the Christine of chairs.
So, the poor old cleaning lady, I'll remind you that the appropriate word these days is pub hygiene technician.
Okay.
She's mopping in the pub when she knocks into the chair. Just knocks into it. Shortly after, she is diagnosed with a brain tumour and apparently dies from that. Then, loads...
What if I'm so clumsy I can't go there?
One by one, loads of cyclists and motorcyclists that visit the pub sit in the chair. They all die in road accidents shortly afterwards. One guy visits the pub, he sits in the chair, he tries to hitchhike home, he gets run over by a car.
Oh my god!
Another man sits in the chair, he dies of a heart attack shortly afterwards.
Rapid fire.
Everyone pokes blame at the chair. You know, it's the chair what done it. Not the fact that old Bert smoked 60 a day and lived off ale and pies and was like a regular drinker. But
I'm just buying what you're selling right now.
There we go. So maybe, that's connected to it. The death of a repairman is also connected to the haunted chair.
No.
So apparently this guy fixed the chair and the landlord had warned him not to sit in it. And although no one actually witnessed the repairman sitting in it, it is guessed that he did anyway because he didn't believe it and he wanted to test out his, whether it was fixed or not. And then he died straight afterwards in a car accident. The chair's also linked to the death of a newspaper reporter who drowned in a bathtub after sitting in the chair, and a secretary who got killed in a bus accident straight after.
Oh my god.
Then a group of builders are all having a drink in the pub, and they dare the youngest amongst them, some poor lad. They try to get him to sit in the haunted chair, so he does, and next thing, the poor lad falls off a roof and dies. So the landlord, Tony, although he admitted that the chair was a great tourist attraction, he decides he's had enough.
Burn it!
The chair has probably killed off all of the tourist drinkers daring enough to make the trip out to the inn anyway. So Tony's like, okay, we're going to put the chair out of sight in the beer cellar. But the haunted Busby Stoop chair wasn't done with killing yet.
Oh my gosh.
So one day the pub gets a delivery from a brewery and the delivery man is carrying the barrels down to the cellar.
It's Charlie. Yeah. It's our friend Charlie.
Yeah.
He's delivered ale.
He sees the chair and thinks, oh, that's an unusually attractive antique chair. Looks nice and comfy. Why is it hidden away in the cellar?
It's for me to sit.
He sits in it and then he actually mentions to Tony, the landlord, that, he'd been interested in the chair. And next thing they know, he dies in a road accident. So at this point, a vicar steps in and he declares the chair to be evil. So realising that the chair is too dangerous to even keep in the pub cellar, Tony, the landlord, does the right thing. And I think it's in 1978, he donates it to a little museum in a nearby town of Thirsk, on the condition that no one ever is to ever sit in it. So, that's a good move on Tony's part because, museum curators and priests are, pretty impervious to, haunted stuff. Museums full of creepy old stuff, and I think ghosts just probably give up because, now that chair is going to have to compete with, 3 possessed dolls and a haunted painting and a mummified cat. There's just too many spooky things in one place. They negate each other. So what they've actually done is they hung the chair from the ceiling in the museum so no one can sit in it. So that's how they're going to stop anyone accidentally smashing through some glass and falling into
fall
it.
One day and impales someone. Busby strikes again.
So the figures vary depending who you hear it from, but locals and people associated with the inn have estimated that around 70 people may have died as a result of sitting in the haunted chair.
I mean, it has been a long time.
And Tony, who was the landlord in the 70s, he said, more like 62, or he thought he could count 62 people that had died. So on a bit of a damper, since the chair has been in the museum, it was examined by a furniture historian.
Oh no! Here comes the fucking truth.
So the furniture historian found that the chair had machine-turned spindles, so like the legs and the sort of sticks that make up the backrest of the chair. Whereas 18th century chairs, so, from the time Busby would have been alive, they were made using a pole lathe. Not machine turned.
Yes.
Hand turned. So he said the chair probably actually dates to 1840, which would have been 138 years after Busby's execution.
When the original landlord was like,
and around the time when the guy who came and wrote the kind of account of the story,
Always
so
works out.
someone got that chair, decided to spin a little money spinner, to attract
Really
some more
smart,
custom,
though,
around that time. But there's no doubt that wherever this chair came from, it definitely gained a sinister reputation. So much so that like ghost hunters will go to see it. There was like a Japanese TV crew made a little documentary about it, and an anonymous American collector has actually offered £1 million to buy it from the museum, but their instructions are they're not allowed to give it anyone. They have to look after it.
It could just be a haunted chair that, the guy got an unwitting chair, or maybe the chair picked up negative energies because...
Well, imagine if you just spin a story about an object for so long, even though it's originates from a lie or a bit of non-truth, about a story. If you keep saying that's a haunted chair, you'll die if you sit in it, it kind of is one of those things where it almost creates a curse in itself, or like creates
or those people who
sinister...
happen to die and all that, like maybe they're a little nervous when they drive, and that's why maybe they or...
Well, exactly. I've seen like explanations, people saying the kind of people who would be kind of brave enough to accept a dare to sit in a chair are also the kind of people who are gonna ride a motorbike, maybe be a bit more reckless on the road. It's a pub, people are drunk. Of course, like if you're gonna hitchhike wasted at night in Yorkshire, you might get hit by a car after you leave the pub because you're wandering around in the middle of the road. Who knows? So even after the chair was donated to the museum, although the chair, hasn't killed again, so yet, until it falls from the ceiling onto some poor visitor, locals at the Busby Stoop Inn still claim to have seen the ghost of Busby on occasion, taking on the form of a dark shadow on the upper floor landings of the pub. Although...
With 4 legs and
Although anyone can visit the museum where the chair is displayed, the site of Busby's execution is now a roundabout junction.
Oh, wow.
And sadly, the Busby Stoop Inn closed down in 2012, which is the way most of the roadside pubs in the UK have gone.
Yeah, a lot of pub culture is dying now.
But it did reopen as an Indian restaurant. So if you're ever in Yorkshire and you fancy a bit of chicken jalfrezi with your ghost hunting, you could go check that out. And that was the story of Busby's stoop chair, a fascinating example of how a real event and a real haunting in a way kind of is embellished and fact and fiction blur, and it becomes a bit of its own legend, of its own. It becomes a myth in its own right.
I'm scared of this chair.
And just how many parts of the story were kind of added in after some clever landlord came up with the idea of this chair. Maybe Busby really did have a special chair, but it's not the one that became famous. Maybe they lost that, it got chucked out. And there's this piece of
sat on it and broke it.
Exactly.
And then
and a piece of completely unrelated furniture that it turns out isn't even from the same period ends up becoming the face of the legend.
it's crazy. I knew you were going to hit me with reality at one point.
Yeah. But, you know, I think, although in some ways this is more of like a story of a cursed object, I think what's interesting... Yeah, they mix. And what's interesting about this one is it's like that thing when something that kind of awful, like a murder and then a very public execution of a kind of locally notorious person,
would know them as
it happens in a little place like that. It's definitely going to leave a bad taste, like even just in memory or like association for the local people with that area, which in a sense is a true haunting. You know, people are haunted by that for generations. The knowledge that of that story, the knowledge that these things happened there in this little spot, that's what fascinates me about that.
Oh, that was great. That was awesome, but now it's my turn. So so this week's topic, of course, haunted objects. I had a little struggle trying to find objects that I was interested in that were haunted that weren't dolls. I remember Violet specifically told me no dolls in a text, like in capitals, like no dolls. So most of my repertoire...
We're going to do a haunted dolls episode
we're gonna do
another
an entire
time.
Episode,
We could do like 2 or 3 episodes.
Like,
there's so many dolls.
I can't wait. But yeah, my story is going to be a little bit different from Violet's. So it begins on the 27th of January in 1850. A man by the name, and I want to know if you know who this is before. A man by the name of Edward John Smith was born in England. 1850, you know? Excellent. She doesn't know. Okay, great. So he would eventually become one of the world's most famous and revered sea captains. Well, questionable.
Okay.
He served the Royal Navy Reserve. He earned a transport medal from King Edward VII and was even given the nickname the Millionaire's Captain as well as others. Once while commanding the vessel the Olympic, which was an ocean liner and one of the largest vessels at the time. This is a time of big ships. Constantly a bigger ship, kind of like early space age, when they're just racing to make the biggest, baddest. But there was an incident. This is taken from Wikipedia. Olympic was being assisted by 12 tugboats. It was being assisted by 12 tugs, the Olympic, when one got caught in the backwash of the Olympic. So it's getting caught in the backwash, and it spun around and collided with the Olympic. And for a moment, it was trapped under the Olympic stern before finally managing to work free and limp to the docks. So this was a time when these vessels were all being made large. And so you can forgive the Captain Edward Smith, as this is all pretty unprecedented stuff. And after seeing some YouTube video, like what I just said, with people trying to attempt to move these large vessels, it just seems like it's a logistical nightmare. It's even in the best circumstance. So you're like, okay, it's okay, Captain. We got you. It's fine. These things happen. Well, another incident. This time with the warship, the HMS Hawk. The warship lost her prow, which is the bit at the front. It's just the bit of the front of the ship or the bow that cuts through the water. Just generally the front. So there's a collision, and the Olympic was also damaged. So they have to salvage parts from the burgeoning ship, the Titanic.
Jack and Rose.
So they basically they borrow parts, and it delays the Titanic being built to fix these ships. Both of these incidents, Captain Edward Smith was on the bridge.
Okay.
So what do you know about the Titanic?
What's the song? Celine Dion.
Every night in my room, I
See you, I feel you.
Yes, okay. So
Steamy hand on inside the fancy car.
So very felt like, okay, so I am obsessed with the Titanic, and listeners as I go will probably understand, not why, but I will shoehorn Titanic into whatever episode I can. So this is gonna come around to haunted object. Just stay with me.
Okay, I'm gonna come up with a Titanic catchphrase. The old lady dropped it into the ocean in the end.
Oh, God. So, here's the thing. Everyone knows about the Titanic. But, like, what do you find? Do you find anything fascinating about it? Like...
I like
is there anything that sticks out?
steam-powered ships. Because I did my recent master's dissertation.
Is the Titanic one of those? Or...
I think so.
I have no idea.
It had smoky stuff coming out of it, right?
There's certain bits of the Titanic that I'm really obsessed with, which is mainly the people's stories and, like, how they reacted to the situation, which is because putting myself into it, like, how would I survive?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure Titanic must have been steam powered because I think that was the only powering happening at that time on big boats.
Well, I'm sure there's lots of people who know stuff about ships. Why don't you send us an email?
I should know because of the dissertation on it, but to be fair, I did only focus on traction engines.
Yeah, traction.
I didn't do trains and ships, so.
So, okay, after these incidents, eventually the Titanic is built, even with massive delays, and they need a captain. Well, why not get someone known as the safe captain? Captain Edward John Smith! Yes!
Oh, yeah! Man with a bad record for stuff going wrong. Perfect choice.
Yeah. And what does this have to do with haunted objects? Well, didn't you know that Captain Edward J. Smith owned a mirror that is supposedly haunted as fuck?
Oh,
so,
sweet.
I'm going to first take you. So this mirror he left behind. He didn't take it with him on the Titanic. He left it behind. It's like supposedly one of the last things he used before he left the house.
Right.
Saw his bearded visage in the mirror.
Okay, so what? So like he'd had this haunted mirror for like ages when all these other ship problems had happened.
It's not haunted when he has it.
Okay, it's not haunted.
This is why you have to.
Okay, so it's fine. Okay.
So he uses his mirror and off he goes to the Titanic. Okay. We're not going to go into everything. We're going to go right into the shit. Shortly after 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, Smith was informed by First Officer William Murdoch that the ship had just collided with an iceberg. It was soon apparent that the ship was seriously damaged. The designer Thomas Andrews reported that all of the first five of the ship's watertight compartments had been breached and the Titanic would sink in under 2 hours. There are conflicting reports about Captain Smith's actions during the evacuation. Some say, and keep in mind it's all coming from survivors, and keep in mind most of the survivors are rich fuckers. So, some say he did all in his power to prevent panic and did his best to assist in the evacuation. Major Arthur Godfrey Pushen of the Royal Canadian Yacht Club said he was doing everything in his power to get the women in these boats and to see that they were lowered properly. I thought he was doing his duty in regard to the lowering of the boats. Robert Williams, Daniel, a first-class passenger, also said, Captain Smith was the biggest hero I ever saw. He stood on the bridge and shouted through a megaphone trying to make himself heard. So, that's reports.
That sounds more useful than playing a violin to the end, you know?
Yeah. Other sources say that he was very ineffective and inactive in preventing loss of life. Captain Smith was an experienced seaman who had served for 40 years at sea with 27 years in command. And this was the first crisis of his career, as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
And he would have known that even if all the boats were fully occupied, more than 1,000 people would remain on the ship as she went down with little or no chance of survival. So he knew this. He's an experienced dude. As Smith began to grasp the enormity of what was about to happen, he appears to have become paralyzed by indecision. He ordered passengers and crew to muster, but from that point onward, he failed to order his officers to put the passengers into the lifeboats. He did not adequately organize the crew. He failed to convey crucial information to his officers and crew. He sometimes gave ambiguous or impractical orders, and he never gave the command to abandon ship. Even some of his bridge officers were unaware for some time after the collision that the ship was sinking. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall did not find out until 1:15 a.m., so like an hour and a half later, barely an hour before the ship went down, while Quartermaster George Rowe was so unaware of the emergency that after the evacuation started, he phoned the bridge from his station to ask why he'd just seen a lifeboat go past. Smith did not inform his officers that the ship did not have enough lifeboats to save everyone. He did not supervise the loading of the lifeboats and seemingly made no effort to find out if his orders were being followed. So, just minutes before the ship started its final plunge, sorry, Smith was still busy releasing Titanic's crew from their duties. He went to the Marconi operator's room. So, Marconi is like one of the dudes that really fucking created radio first.
Okay.
If it wasn't for this Marconi shit, these people would not have survived, because that's how they found them, was radio shit. I'm not going to go into it because I'm not technical in that way, but Marconi. All right. And they released junior Marconi officer Harold Bride and senior wireless operator John Jack Phillips from their duties. He then carried out a final tour of the deck, telling crew members, now it's every man for himself. At 2:10 a.m., Steward Edward Brown saw the captain approach with a megaphone in his hand. So this is right when the ship's about to go down. He heard him say, well, boys, do your best for the women and children and look out for yourselves. He saw the captain walk onto the bridge alone. This was the last reliable sighting of Smith. After that, no one knows what happened to him. He was in the bridge. Then a few minutes later, trimmer Samuel Hemming found the bridge apparently empty. 5 minutes later, the ship disappeared beneath the ocean. Smith perished that night along with around 1,500 others, and his body was never recovered. So this is a quote. I saw Captain Smith on the bridge. My eyes seemingly clung to him. The deck from which I had leapt was now immersed. The water had risen slowly and was now to the floor of the bridge. Then it was to Captain Smith's waist. I saw him no more. He died a hero. So.
Wow.
Pretty fucked up shit. Titanic's fucked up.
Yeah.
And I don't want to besmirch the good name of Captain Edward Smith, who had a really good record.
Yeah.
But we all know that there were
the deal is like, if he had these little problems before with these other ships, but then, I don't know about, I think back then, there were problems all the time with ships. Like, the freaking front of the ship falling off in the sea probably wasn't even that bad a thing. It was like, oh, whoops.
Whoopsies.
You know.
But this is the thing, like, they knew there wasn't enough lifeboats. It was a giant look at my dick ship.
Yeah.
And they were going too fast. All these problems, like, I would love to get into Titanic, like, for serious as an episode. Just as from different points of view, that's just horrifying and crazy what people did for each other when that happened. Yeah. And you see all sorts of types of people. I think it's very telling. Yeah. As a man of honor and reputation who's had a couple blunders recently in his career, I think, and he knew all that stuff. I think it's very telling that he went down with the ship. I know people always use the thing of, oh, it's tradition for the captain, blah, 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 to go down with the ship. It's not unprecedented that they don't do that. Plenty of captains I've heard about in history that don't do that. Yeah. Then they keep going, keep fighting, and keep helping people. Yeah. Because they're leaders and they need to. Yeah, you have to be that. I think it's like that kind of character, you know. To my theory is the shame was like too great for him to bear. Like, I think he knew already. I mean, that's two different quotes from several people that he was in the megaphone saying, "Do what you can for the women and children, and look out for yourselves." Like, that's not what I want to hear from my captain. No, like. And then he just goes to the bridge and I guess presumably drowns there. Like, God. So, after his death, Captain Smith's housekeeper, Ethelwyn, was invited to choose any one item of his property as a keepsake and in lieu of wages, because the woman couldn't afford her anymore. This letter, which I'm going to read from, was penned by her sister-in-law, Hilda, who explains that the housekeeper chose the silver mirror. Okay. It's addressed to someone called Ida and goes as follows. She, meaning Ethelwyn, always spooked me when she said at that time she could still see Captain Smith's face on it in the anniversary of when the Titanic was sunk. So there are stories from the housekeepers and stuff that basically every year in the anniversary of Titanic, you can see Captain Smith flittering about in the picture.
Ooh.
Last year,
In the reflection.
yeah,
Okay.
in the mirror, you can see him as if he's there with you, like photobombing you, like just. So last year, the mirror went on sale for auction, and of course, one of the first papers to do. I've got this from the Mirror,
Okay.
which is a shitty, like it was in like the Mirror, the Sun, all those trash mags that are ready. So this is what auctioneer Richard Winterton said about the mirror, the sell man, the hype man. The last time Captain Edward John Smith saw his own noble bearded visage before leaving home to take the helm of the Titanic was possibly in this very mirror. Bargain Hunt and Dickinson's real deal star, Richard added, interest in the Titanic is as strong as ever. This mirror could fetch well in excess of 10,000 at auction. I didn't look how much it actually sold for because I don't care. But I want that mirror, actually. Last month, the couple was left terrified after the ghost. So this is in October 2018, I think. It was October around that time, November. So a couple was left terrified after the ghost of the captain of the Titanic photobombed them in a historic pub with connections to the doomed ship. So that's from the pub.
So just a mirror in the pub. A random mirror in a pub or something. Or a photo frame.
Actually, I think it was in the pub.
Oof.
Yeah. Belfast Robinson pub, it's being sold from this pub. So Cheryl 34 and Luke Arkless 34 hit headlines after they visited Belfast Robinson's pub and snapped a romantic shot together before they were horrified to spot a spooky face right behind them.
Oh, that's the worst.
Which bore an uncanny resemblance to Captain Smith. The letter also goes on to say, even with one's feet firmly on land, and in the sunshine of a clear afternoon, there is something otherworldly about seeing your own reflection in such an object. So yeah, basically someone bought it in December, which was the 107th anniversary of Titanic. So that means this year it was the 108th.
Right.
So I mean, that's pretty much it. It was a way for me to shoehorn in some Titanic stuff, but everything associated with the ship is somehow considered haunted, and I didn't want to just do a haunted ship.
Yeah,
like,
of course.
There's so many items that we could go into, and places and stuff that are connected that people are considered completely haunted.
Well, the thing that's so interesting about, like, that captain is that, like, when you try to rationalize why you would like haunt a mirror, or like why a mirror would become the haunted object, or why reflections would become haunted, it's like, wow, like the last thing you do, like while you're on land before you go off on this like doomed venture at sea, is to like look at that mirror. That just like
and it expresses vanity as well. And he's like this crazy cool captain. He's head honcho, the biggest ship in the world, making its maiden voyage.
So after you die, you just haunt this freaking mirror world, like the world of reflections. Afterwards, you know. Just be careful about the last thing you do before you go on holiday, you know. Or
there's also a quick mirror story I can tell you about a plantation. I think it's in North Carolina. I didn't like it because it didn't have enough meat to it at all. It's basically this plantation where supposedly this women and children died during the war. It was most likely Union soldiers raped and killed them. But then it turns out there's no evidence about it, but like there's this huge fuck off mirror that whenever they died, was not covered. And as we know, when you don't cover a mirror after someone's passed, that it could be that they can jump into that mirror.
I was gonna say, I remember hearing stories about from my grandfather about when he visited older relatives when he was a kid, and I think even his parents or my great-grandparents did this as well, and my mum witnessed it when she was a little child, was that people covered anything with a reflection. So mirrors used to have curtains on, or at least where my family were from in England, and even the first TVs, because they were essentially a mirror when they were turned off. They had a curtain for that, and it was very important to cover mirrors and bits of any glass reflection and TV when there was a thunderstorm. So there definitely, it's really cool to like think about like just how like fascinating mirrors have been to people.
But there's so many haunted mirrors.
Yeah,
like...
mirrors are great, and it's like it's my favorite scene in a horror movie when you can see the freaking ghosty thing. The woman is brushing her teeth, and as a horrible ghost comes out of the bathtub.
You know what traumatized me?
In the background, and you can see it in the reflection. Or
I had to cover my TV after watching Signs when the alien walks by on the TV and you can only see it. Oh god! I covered my TV. I was a young kid, like 12, 13, and I would cover my TV from then on. It's
my favorite like technique in horror movies. Is the like what can the audience see in the reflection that the character isn't noticing.
Oh yeah, the haunted mirrors for your nerve, haunted fucking chairs for your nerve. That was a murderous chair. My mirror didn't claim anybody's life. It's just spooky. But whoever owns that now, once a year, can see Captain Edward John Smith.
Pretty sweet. I mean, the thing is, there are crazy collectors out there that want to buy all the stuff, that want to own
that kind of money. I would have all the spooky things. I can't wait till people give us like. We need to be famous right now so I can have a P.O. box and people can send me haunted things.
Mm. I mean, yeah, it's just interesting. That's like. If places can be haunted, if people can be kind of possessed, why not? Furniture and
why not?
Everyday stuff, you know, if you like something so much, or if you're so attached to like a material item, like a bit of jewelry or something, like, you know, maybe you do kind of put some energy into it, or you become attached to it in some sort of weird way. Maybe poltergeists are just like really attracted to retro children's toys. I guess, yeah, if you just like loved something or spent a lot of time with something that you could wield some kind of power over it, if there is some kind of afterlife or some kind of beyond the grave power. But I feel like in the chair's case, it is almost more like, is it possible to create bad vibes or like a sinister power just by telling a story and placing that story on a random old chair?
How magical are humans naturally without even realizing?
The power of words, you know? I think as someone who's studied archaeology, I've spent maybe more time than most in like museum-y places or like handling human bones. Of course, I had the human skull at home when I was a kid. We've got taxidermy, you know. I've touched things like arrowheads that might have like hurt or like killed someone. I've touched all this like super old stuff. But even, you know, I've touched all this kind of stuff and I don't think I've ever felt anything like bad attached to those items. Like even human remains, which are like the first kind of items to be associated with the supernatural or ghosts or some kind of warning, to me is like, it sounds a bit like woo-woo, but the energy of like human remains feels very asleep or like vacant to me, you know. Or you can think about if I've found excavated like a human bone, or I'm in a museum situation, I'm handling some human remains, all you can think about is like, wow, this is a part of a person who was once alive, like I am, and they had a life and they died, and I wonder what their life was like and what did they see in their lifetime, you know. And it's it's like a very vacant energy, you know. I've never felt anything weird attached to something like that. I think the only stuff in a museum situation that I would be hesitant to handle, because I would be worried about something supernatural, would actually be like witch bottles or some kind of like witchcraft item, because I would be really afraid to accidentally damage something like that. And plus some of those like witch bottles, if you don't know what a witch bottle is, it's people used to put items into the sides of buildings or like into the walls of buildings, especially in Britain. They might have done it in America. They probably do it all over the planet, to ward off like bad spirits, ward off witches. And so some of those witch bottles supposedly contain stuff like ancient urine and like gross stuff like nails and bits of
most
organic matter.
Diseases, because everyone
Exactly.
there was dying of something horrible.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to touch. I wouldn't want to handle
really.
that kind of stuff for many reasons. Thanks for listening
Yeah.
to this episode of World Weary. Get in touch if you have any haunted object stories that you want to share with us. Maybe you live in an abandoned children's hospital full of rusty wheelchairs that mysteriously move in the night. Maybe you live in a haunted prison.
Maybe you've got a giant teddy bear in your attic that so far is quiet, but now you're worried. Now you're worried about.
Maybe you've got a haunted teddy bear in your attic that sometimes you wake up at 3 a.m. to the sound of shuffling
No, don't.
in the corridor outside your bedroom. Sometimes you pull back the curtain at night and there's a bear outside staring in. Email us. What's our address?
worldwearypodcast@gmail.com.
Worldwearypod or podcast?
worldwearypodcast@gmail.com.
Okay.
Our worldwearypod is our Twitter.
Okay, we'll check that. If you don't have any haunted wheelchairs, go check your attic, check your cellar, your basement if you're American, and see if there's any creepy stuff in there and let us know.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.